So we're going to talk about the First World War in absolute brevity. Okay, we're not going too deep into this. We're going to rush right through it, but there's some big important ideas that I want you guys to recall from what you studied last year. First thing, World War I was a really big war. In fact, it spanned the whole world, right? Not just in Europe. It was fought in Asia. It was fought in Africa. It was fought in the open seas. It was by far the most deadly war that mankind has ever fought. So World War I is, and it was so big that at the end of it, and we're going to get here in just a few minutes, it was so big at the end of it, the mantra was, this was the war to end all wars. This war is the war that just had to be fought, and now that it was fought, we will do everything we can do to avoid fighting another war. Because in the lead up to the First World War, there was hardly anybody that truly wanted to avoid a war. Okay? In fact, people were excited about getting into the war. People thought the war would be beneficial for their country. People thought war was beneficial for young men. It was something that you wanted to send your boys to. And then in the aftermath of the First World War, it was completely the opposite. This is Europe in 1914, and before. We notice that the map looks quite a bit different. We've got countries that are on this map that don't exist after the First World War. We've got empires that are on this map that aren't going to exist after the First World War. And then there's a number of countries that are around today that aren't on this map, that are a part of these large empires. We talked, or you probably talked last year, about the pre-World War I years being a story of great powers of Europe, all right? And there were 5 of them. You got Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. But Germany kind of messed up this great power system. And the great power system goes back to the early 1800s, when Napoleon from France started moving his way to conquer Europe. Everything. Conquer all of Europe, right? In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, there was a meeting in Vienna, Austria. And you guys, just listen, relax. You don't have to take a bunch of notes on this. There's a meeting in Vienna, Austria, where diplomats from these great powers got together and said, wow, we want to set up a system where this doesn't happen anymore. So a balance of power, as we're going to use this phrase a lot, was established in Europe between these great powers, Britain, France. Germany didn't actually exist at the time. Okay, we've got a country called Prussia. Germany was, like this portion of Germany was just about a lot of independent principalities, okay? Austria-Hungary and Russia. They worked out a deal to establish a balance of power so an issue like Napoleon can't show its head again. Because what ultimately defeated Napoleon, it wasn't any one country. It was all of these other countries defeating Napoleon together. This works pretty well until 1870. And in 1870, there's a war that breaks out between Prussia and France. And we call that war the? Good, yeah. Franco-Prussian War. Excellent. In the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War, France is defeated. But Prussia, up here, will join with all of these German principalities. They already had a lot in common, but they're going to join with these German principalities. So we're going to have a united Germany that gets far larger than it ever was before. And what might start happening to that balance of power that was established back in 1815? It might not be quite as balanced. All right? And as time presses on, that lack of balance is going to show itself even more. Germany now not only has the most powerful land military in the world with the Prussian army, but now they're an economic powerhouse as well, because all of these little principalities were quite economically powerful. And it's got France very nervous. France, who was just defeated by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War. So we're going to get France, and we're going to get Russia, who's also a little nervous, starting to rebuild or build up their militaries to far greater extents. And this is also a time of what is known as the Second Industrial Revolution, when we're going to get even greater military capacities, even greater ability to mass produce everything that armies are going to need. And then you've got Germany. Now, let me show you something else here. You've got Germany that wants to take part in this game, in the imperialism game. This is 1900, and we can see the imperialist powers of the world. Well, some of us can see. We can see the imperialist powers of the world. You've got Britain here, who's controlling about half of Africa and the Indian subcontinent and Alaska and up in Canada. You've got France, that's got pretty much the other half of Africa. You've got Belgium in there, and you've got Spain and Portugal with some chunks of Africa as well. You've got European countries taking control in the Far East and in Southeast Asia. And Germany, which was a brand new country, and the child of Prussia, Prussia never cared about creating an overseas empire. They only wanted a land-based empire. And even Germany in its first few years was content with a land-based empire. But as we get to the turn of the century, you get a Germany that wants to stretch its legs. You get a Germany that wants to do what all of these other countries have been doing for decades. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, the king of Germany, wants Germany to have what he would say is their place in the sun. Okay, they're like owed this. Because in their mind, Germany is supreme, über alles. All right, they're over everybody else. And it's not crazy for Germans to think this. Because if you look around the turn of the century, Germany is doing a lot of pretty amazing things. They've got a powerful military. They've got one of the strongest economies in the world, strongest economy in continental Europe. They've got the most advanced rail system in continental Europe. When you look at to the sciences, in the prior to 1914, there are more Germans winning Nobel Prizes in science than any other country's citizens combined. You think about the arts and about culture, think of the musicians that you guys have heard. If I were to force you to name a bunch of classical musicians, chances are they're going to be German. Maybe some Austrians in there.
And Russian.
Or if you want to, yeah, okay, but I think the man on the street, if I went up to him and said, hey, give me all the composers you're aware of, he's probably going to, well, stop it, you're doing that on purpose. But he's probably going to say German ones. Anyway, so Germany wants to have their place in the sun. Kaiser Wilhelm II's feeling like a little disenfranchised. He's like, oh man, everybody wants to go to Paris. Nobody wants to go to Berlin. This isn't fair. I want Germany to be number one. So he starts growing his military even more. He starts building a navy to compete with the British. And this has got everybody on the continent who has long enjoyed this relative balance of power and relative peace and harmony. It's got everybody nervous. All right? Then we fast forward to this issue. This is Austria-Hungary. And you guys can see Austria-Hungary here, divided up into all of the various ethnic groups that make up Austria-Hungary. Austria is a long-lasting empire. In the 19th century, they were weakening. They joined with Hungary, and they made what I call in my class is a massive multi-ethnic empire. Even though they're not that massive as other empires go, still a big country, and they've got a lot of ethnicities that they're dealing with there. Austria-Hungary is ruled out of Vienna by an Austrian guy, German-speaking guy, a guy named Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph's getting a little long in the tooth, which means he's getting old. He's old. He's an old guy. All right. His nephew is named Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand is the heir apparent to Franz Joseph. He's going to be the next emperor. Franz Joseph's got a kind of a sad life. He had a son, he died. So Franz Ferdinand is going to be the next emperor. Franz Ferdinand is young. He's a little modern, and he's got some big ideas for how to run this empire in the 20th century. One of the problems this empire deals with is all different kinds of people living in the empire that don't necessarily want to be ruled out of Vienna. So Franz Ferdinand's got an idea. Let's create a federal system out of this. Let's turn our empire into, from one where Vienna is dictating to all, to more of a federal system. You guys have heard this word federal system before, right? Can anybody explain to me what a federal system is? We live in one.
There are regional capitals, etc.
Sure. Okay, shared power. There's a central government, a national government, and then there are some kind of regional entities that can run their own show. So Mississippi can do what Mississippi wants to do within the parameters of the U.S. Constitution, but they can set up their own rule of law for their state. Michigan can do what we want to do. That's a federal system. Franz Ferdinand has an idea of converting the empire into more of a federal system. Yes, Vienna will still maybe handle military issues and diplomatic issues. They might handle currency issues, big issues for the nation. But then maybe the people down here in Bosnia, they can run their show a little bit more. All right, they can live a little bit more autonomously than they have in the past, trying to make all of these different types of people feel more comfortable in this big empire. Now, Franz Joseph, the old man, doesn't really like this all that much because it's giving up some authority from Vienna. But he's old, he's going to die, Franz Ferdinand's going to take over. But there's also another group that doesn't like this very much. And we point down into this area. Now, this part of Europe, we call this the Balkan Peninsula. All right? And you'll still hear about this region today. There's a country called Serbia, just to the southeast of Austria-Hungary. Serbia's been around for decades. Serbia is a country that in the 19th century gets their independence from, anyone?
Ottomans.
The Ottoman Empire, very good. So Serbs get their independence. They defeat the weakening Ottoman Empire. They gain their independence from the Ottoman Empire. But not all Serbs live in Serbia. Some Serbs live in Bosnia, which also was liberated from or freed itself from the Ottoman Empire, but was claimed by Austria-Hungary. Some Serbs live in Bosnia. There are some nationalistic Serbs. We're going to use this word nationalism a lot when we talk about World War I and into World War II. I like to reference two types of nationalism. There's the we are German, we love Germany, look at all of our great composers, look at all these great scientists, Germany, number one. And then there's the type of nationalism where we are Serbs, but we live in Bosnia. We don't have our country, but we want to have a country. We want to be a part of a greater Serbia. And that's what some of these Serbs are looking towards. They don't want to be a part of Austria-Hungary. They don't want to be dictated to by Vienna. They want to be a part of a bigger Serbia for Serb people. And an organization forms in the early 20th century that's going to try to fight for this. And it's known as the Black Hand. Very good. It's a terrorist organization that wants to strike at Austria to try to gain the Serbs in Bosnia to become a part of the become a part of the Serbian state. They're going to use violent means. They're going to attempt assassinations. They're going to do terrorist attacks in order to get this. All right? The Black Hand doesn't like Franz Ferdinand very much. Because I already said, what is Franz Ferdinand, what's his goal? What's he want to do for his empire?
Form a sort of United States of Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, make more of a federal system. And what would making a federal system do to the Serbs in Bosnia? What's that? It would give them some autonomy. It would give them a little control. Would that make them happy or would that make them sad? It would probably make them happy. It would make them content. Do content people riot?
No.
Do content people protest? Do content people try to bring down the state? No.
Well, if the purge is an actual thing.
Stop. So, no, that doesn't happen. The Black Hand and the terrorists that want to bring down Austria-Hungary, or at least break off the Serbs in Bosnia and bring them into Serbia, they need angry people. They need people willing to fight. They need people that don't want to be complacent with being a part of Austria-Hungary. So Franz Ferdinand is a problem for the Black Hand as well. In June of 1914, June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is in Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia, that region in southeastern Austria-Hungary. Franz Ferdinand is there to tour a new library and museum, and he's with his wife, and they're in a motorcade, and he's assassinated by one of these members of the Black Hand, shot and killed. Franz Joseph is livid. Okay, the heir apparent, his next in line, even though he didn't like the guy very much, has now been assassinated by by Serbs. And Franz Joseph and Austria, they're going to blame Serbia for this attack. They make demands onto Serbia. They say, Serbia, you need to let us into your country to investigate this crime because we think it goes deeper than just this terrorist organization, the Black Hand. We think the government is complicit in it as well. You need to let us into your country to investigate, to arrest, and then to put criminals on trial. And Serbia says, no, it's our country. Let us investigate. Let us handle this. We will deal with any criminals. It sounds a lot like the story you guys don't remember because you were 2, but back in 2001, the United States was attacked in the September 11th attacks, of course, and not long afterwards, we knew Osama bin Laden was guilty of orchestrating this attack, and we knew that he was based out of Afghanistan, and we told the Taliban government in Afghanistan to hand over Osama bin Laden so we can deal with him. And they said, no, you can't do that. Let us investigate, and we will deal with any wrongdoing that might have happened. And of course, the United States wouldn't stand for that, all right? And then we go to war in Afghanistan. Well, back to 1914. Why can't Serbia let Austria come in? Why didn't Afghanistan in 2001 let the United States go in?
Because they're complicit.
Say, I explain what you mean.
Well, like with the Taliban. Well, the Taliban example, they were complicit. If they were providing shelter to known terrorists.
So they know what they were doing, and they know if we got in to investigate, they know they would have been found out. Right? Sure. And similar cases are true back in 1914. There was actually a pretty high-ranking government official that was affiliated with the Black Hand. It didn't go all the way up to the top in Serbia, but there certainly were government officials that were affiliated. Also, it would destroy the sovereignty of those nations. That's a big word, right? We know sovereignty. What does it mean to be a sovereign nation? You have a right to rule yourself. So your country is your country, and no one can come in and step on your toes. Well, if the United States was able to waltz right into Afghanistan with the Taliban's, under the Taliban's desires and do whatever kind of investigation we wanted to, Afghan sovereignty would have been threatened. All right? They couldn't do it. And just like that, Serbia in 1914 couldn't let Austria in. Now, Austria's got problems, though. They can't just go waltzing right into Serbia against their wishes, because that's like war. And wars are pretty scary, especially when Serbia has a friend, and they have a friend in Russia. Now, one theme that we're going to address a lot in this class is nobody does anything out of the kind of... I take that back. Very rarely do nations do things out of the kindness of their hearts. All right? There's examples of like humanitarian cases and things like that where, okay, that's just pure generosity, things that you don't have to do, but you do. But maybe we even do those things because if we didn't do those, people would be like, America, why aren't you doing something? But whatever. Rarely do nations do things when it's not in their own self-interest, all right? There's a nationalism movement in the turn of the century, all right? One of these nationalisms that arises is an idea of pan-Slavism. Like all Slavic people should kind of stick together because for centuries they've been abused, whether it be by Austrians or by Ottomans, that the Slavs of the world need to stick together. Well, the biggest and most powerful Slavic nation in the world in 1914 is...
Pre-Soviet Russia.
Russia. Hey, we can just call it Russia. Russia. Serbia is a Slavic nation. So Russia says, hey, Slavs down in the Balkan Peninsula like Serbia, I've got your back. You don't have anything to worry about. Now, is this Russia just being absolutely benevolent?
Hell no.
No. Relax, Tommy. No. Why not? What does Russia want out of the deal? Let's go back to a map. What do you think Russia wants out of the deal? That's not a good one. Let's look at this one. They might want to land, but they're not looking to take anyone over. What do you think, Greg?
They probably want territory on the Mediterranean for trade.
Absolutely. For trade, for military prowess. Russia has long coveted, going back to the 1600s, they've long coveted a warm water port. Okay, we're going to use that phrase a lot this year. A warm water port. They got plenty of sea coast, right? But it's frozen for much of the year. They've got coastlines in the Pacific. But that doesn't really help you out in the Atlantic or in the Mediterranean. Russia covets a warm water port. The Balkan Peninsula is on the Adriatic Sea and on the Mediterranean Sea. So Russia, yeah, they've got ideas of pan-Slavism, but they also want friends that have access to those warm water parts. If I help you out, maybe you'll let me set up a base on the Adriatic. The Adriatic is this little offshoot of the Mediterranean here. So Russia is Serbia's ally. And Austria is naturally concerned if Austria is going to be naturally concerned if Serbia gets help from Russia, because Austria knows it can defeat Serbia, but they're not 100% sure that they can defeat Russia. So Austria goes to their longtime ally, Germany. A lot of, there's connections between Germany for centuries. There's a lot common language.
There are also connections from but the thing is, most of the royals were related to each other.
Most of the royals throughout Europe were related to each other at this point, because royals have to marry royals, so it's all inbred. Anyway, Austria goes to Germany, because they're worried about attacking Serbia because of Russia. So Austria goes to Germany, and Germany issues the famous blank check. You guys probably remember this from last year, where Germany says, Austria, you do what you've got to do with Serbia. That's your business. You got to attack Serbia, attack Serbia. They don't even say that, but you do what you've got to do. It's a blank check. You can do anything you want. But please know that if Russia ever were to attack you, or anybody were to attack you, we will stand by our longtime alliance with you. Now, Austria knows they can attack Serbia, and that Germany's got their back if Russia steps in. So now the next question leading up to war is, what's Russia going to do? Well, as we fast forward, of course we know. Austria will eventually open fire on Serbia. Russia mobilizes their army. When Russia mobilizes their army, a clock starts ticking for Germany. The clock that's ticking is a 42-day window that Germany has to defeat France and then attack Russia, according to the German military plan called the Schlieffen Plan. And you guys need to be familiar with this. Germany knew that they were surrounded by enemies, Russia to their east and France to their west. And they knew that fighting each of them at the same time could be a disaster. So in the early 20th century, a German military official named Schlieffen developed a plan where he would attack into France through the flat lands of neutral Belgium. He would sweep around Paris to cut Paris off from any aid that might come from outside. He would get France to surrender. He would throw all of his troops onto trains whose timelines were carefully calculated, where they can get all the way back across Germany, and at that point, within 42 days, fight the invading Russians. The Schlieffen Plan said Russia can't really do you any harm until 6 weeks. It's going to take them that long to get rolling. So as Russia mobilizes, Germany's got to figure out what it's going to do. What is its next move going to be? Is it truly going to stand behind its longtime alliance with Austria? Yes, it is. All right. Is it truly going to go to war with France and Russia? Yes, it is. What about Britain? They're not that worried about Britain. Britain doesn't have an alliance with France. Britain doesn't have an alliance, a military alliance or obligation to Russia. Britain, Germany thinks, is just going to mind its own business. Britain's an island. They don't have to worry too much. Well, Britain is going to get involved here. And they're going to stand behind what some who are against the war are going to call a scrap of paper. In 1839, when Belgium was formed, the nations that put Belgium together signed a treaty guaranteeing Belgian sovereignty and neutrality. Belgium's not allowed to pick sides in wars. Belgium's not allowed to pick sides in wars. Belgium is not allowed to be invaded by any nation. Well, ultimately, upon the invasion of neutral Belgium, at the start of the Schlieffen Plan, Britain is going to decide to stand behind this 1839 Treaty of London, and they declare war on Germany. So now Germany and Austria-Hungary are fighting a war against Britain and France and Russia, and this is the First World War. Within a month and a half, The Ottoman Empire is going to join the war effort on the German side. At the start of the war, there was no telling which way the Ottoman Empire was going to go, and both Britain and Germany were lobbying for the Ottomans to join their side. The Ottomans ultimately joined Team Germany because, why does anybody join a particular team? They think they're going to win. And the Ottoman Empire's got a long history of fighting with the Russians. So they're not going to join the side of the Russians. So it just makes more sense for the Ottomans to join Germany. So as we press into the war, the Schlieffen Plan is executed, and it goes disastrously poorly for the Germans. Belgium is harder for the Germans to get through. Defensive technology at the outset of World War I is far supreme to, is far stronger than offensive technology. For example, a newish weapon like the machine gun is a formidable defensive weapon. All right, they're not easy to pick up and carry around with you, but when you've got them in your fortifications, they can easily slow down an invading German army. So Belgium is far harder for the Germans to get through than they accounted for. And then on the other side of Europe, Russia is mobilizing far faster than the Germans had accounted for. So the Schlieffen Plan right off the bat doesn't go so well. And now you've also got the British pouring into the war effort. So instead of sweeping around Paris, the Schlieffen Plan is stopped short. And ultimately, the French and the British and the Germans will be engaged in a stalemate that will press itself all the way up to the English Channel, and from there stretch all the way down to the Swiss Alps in a line that's going to be known as the Western Front. All right? That's where the war in the West will be fought for the next 4 years, with very little movement, very little ground gained, but millions of casualties on both sides. So this is the First World War. I left a couple of images in here. Here are some soldiers in their trench. The Western Front is noted for the trench warfare, this stalemated war because of the machine gun technologies. Guys could not make frontal assaults or successful frontal assaults. They tried. They tried at the cost of millions of men. So guys could not gain much ground on the Western Front because on the Western Front you had two relatively matched armies in terms of technology and capabilities, the Germans and the British and the French. Here's a modern picture of some now overgrown trenches that you can see in France and in Belgium still to this day. And you just kind of get an image of what a disaster this would have been. Each one of these little pockmarks in the land, those are from shells that have exploded. The trench, you see, it's got this zigzaggy nature. Anyone know why the trenches were dug like that? Anyone know why the trenches were dug like that? Jasmine? No? Anybody? Yeah.
Is it the tanks can roll through?
No, not to stop tanks from rolling through them. The hope for the tanks was in some cases to roll over them. Yes, sir?
It was so that if the trench did get breached, the people that were breaching can't just shoot all the way straight down and kill everyone.
Yeah, there's a little bit of that to it. Nicholas?
So you can fit more people, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite where they were going. Brian?
That's my guess.
Tommy, you're a little bit on track. More so, because one of the greatest dangers to these guys living in trenches, it isn't going to help too much with gas. One of the greatest dangers to the guys living in the trenches was not machine gun fire, because when you're in the trench, you're cool. Machine guns can't do anything to you. But it was what? Yes, sir?
Is it like, so, say someone was to breach and cut off that certain area so it's zigzag?
No, it's still going to be tough to do. Yeah?
It's the artillery fire.
The artillery fire, yeah. So if you can imagine, if it was a straight trench that went on for hundreds of yards, a shell that lands right in the trench is going to explode. And then that blast is going to keep going until something stops it, whether it be a human or just ultimately gravity and like just doesn't make it any further. Well, when you zigzag it, it leaves much less of a blast radius to cause damage at. All right? So if a shell lands right here, you're going to have some big problems. You're going to have some big problems if you're standing here or if you're standing here. But if you were right around that corner, you're going to make it.
Yeah, but if it lands right at the intersection, you're screwed.
Sure. But anyway, it's to help out with the casualties that might come from shelling. So war was, of course, not just fought on the Western Front. This is World War I, so it was a world war. We've got war in the West. We also, at the outset of war, I said Russia, mobilized faster than the Germans accounted for. So we're going to have a major war on the Eastern Front. The nature of war on the Eastern Front, though, was quite different. With the lack of organization and lack of skilled soldiers and lack of equipment that the Russians suffered compared to their German counterparts, the Eastern Front was much more mobile. And within months, the Germans will be pushing the Russians back hundreds of miles, okay, in the Eastern Front. There's also a Southern Front that's going to be fought between the British primarily and the Ottoman Empire. There's going to be combat in the Middle East. One second. There's going to be combat in the Middle East where technology. I can't land on what I want to land on. It's killing me. There's also combat in the Middle East, where you guys might have heard of a guy named Lawrence of Arabia, or T.E. Lawrence, who's a British officer who trained Arab soldiers to fight against the Ottoman Empire. There's also fighting in Africa, as British colonials are going to be waging war against German colonials. There's going to be fighting in Asia, as the Japanese are fighting to take German holdings in East Asia. So this truly is a world war, and we're not going to go too much deeper into it. Now, I have this picture of this guy. Anybody know who he is?
Lenin.
Yeah, Vladimir Lenin. Another tactic that the Germans employed through the course of the war, in hopes of getting Russia to drop out of the war, was to send Lenin, who had been exiled from Russia at the turn of the century because he was a revolutionary in Russia. He was a threat to the Tsar's regime in Russia. Germany grabbed up Lenin and sent him back to St. Petersburg. So Lenin gets into Russia, and he does just that. He starts fomenting revolutionary talk in Russia. And in 1917, first in February, and then later in October, there's going to be 2 revolutions in Russia. In February of 1917, the Tsar's family, the Nicholas II and the Romanov family, who've been ruling Russia for centuries, the Tsar's family is going to be ousted from power, and Russia becomes a kingdom no more. A provisional government is established, but that provisional government fails to get Russia out of the war. And why does it fail to get Russia out of the war? Because if we go back to this slide, if we can, as we go back to this slide, we see that Russia has lost tremendous territory. And so if you leave the war when you're losing, you lose a lot. So the provisional government, even though they know the war is terrible and they know the Russian people want out of the war, the provisional government holds on and keeps in the war with the hope that the war can soon be won. Well, anger in Russia doesn't dissipate, and by October of 1917, a second revolution, led this time by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik Revolution, ousts the provisional government with a promise to the Russian people that they will get out of the war. And they absolutely do get out of the war. Immediately, Lenin calls on to Germany to negotiate terms of a treaty. That treaty is ultimately signed, and that is known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It's signed in early 1918, and it is a disaster for the Russians. They lose tremendous amounts of territory. This thick black line is the line of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So in a few minutes, we're going to be talking about the Treaty of Versailles and the punishments that Germany is going to suffer with the Treaty of Versailles. Let's reserve some of our tears for feeling sympathetic for the Germans, because the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk gives an example of how the Germans would treat the nations that they were going to defeat in war. So if we want to feel too bad about France being rough on Germany, Germany was going to be extremely rough on France or anybody else, and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk proves that to us. Now, this should be a disaster for the Allies, because now there's no two-front war. The Germans are out, or the Russians are out, and now, well, let me repeat. Now the Russians are out, and Germany doesn't have to fight a two-front war. They can send all of those Eastern Front soldiers and send them over to the Western Front. But fortunately, American presidential politics says that Woodrow Wilson, based on precedent that has long been established, isn't going to run for a third term of office. And Woodrow Wilson already won a presidential election in 1916, his second term, under a campaign promise of keeping America out of the European war. But he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. So he can start thinking about getting America involved in the war. And it's going to be made easier by the Germans, who will, after an initial promise to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare, where the Germans will just not sink any ship on the open seas. Initially, Germany had suspended that after the disaster of the Lusitania, for example. But they will resume submarine warfare. And this will anger Americans as American shipping is threatened by this. And then a side note story where the Germans are attempting to scheme with the Mexicans to get the Mexicans to invade the United States to keep us occupied. That telegram, the Zimmerman note, is intercepted by British cryptologists. And they decipher it, and they let the United States know what the Germans were up to. This strongly pushes anti-German sentiment in the United States, and it allows Woodrow Wilson to push Congress for a declaration of war, which he gets. So just as the Russians are backing out of the war, the United States is going to be entering the war. So what could have been a German advantage is now neutralized by the United States, and even more so, because the United States is a more formidable ally than the Russians were going to be. Because we have men, virtually limitless numbers of men we can supply to the war effort, and we have resources, virtually limitless resources we can supply to the war effort. By early 1918, the United States is in Europe. By the summer of 1918, we're taking part in many major battles. Germany puts on a final offensive known as the Spring Offensive of 1918. It fails. By the fall of 1918, Germany knows they have to back out of the war, and on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, an armistice is signed, and a ceasefire now exists in the war, which is a really major bummer for someone who got killed by a shell on the 8th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, because the armistice was worked out hours before that. But they wanted to wait for a symbolic time. But it's good for you because it's easier to remember. All right, so maybe it was worth that. So the war is going to come to an end. The war is going to come to an end at disastrous costs. You guys can't see these numbers, but you'll be able to see them from your TV screen later, or your computer screen. We can see some ridiculous numbers. Russia mobilized 12 million men through the course of the war. Mobilized means they're soldiers ready to go fight the war. Of that, almost 2 million died, almost 5 million wounded. Horrible numbers, thank you. The British Empire, we're looking at over 3 million killed or wounded. The casualties are insane. No war has ever been fought like this. In France, who was losing 1.3 million and with another 4 million plus wounded. And a lot of these soldiers that were wounded, many of them were maimed. You know, they're not going to live their lives as they once were. The war was such a disaster, nobody after World War I could look at this as a glorious affair. And so countries are going to make moves to make sure another war like this can never happen. And that's what's going to take us to our next talk.